Sukhihotu, happy greetings to all the brothers and sisters in the Dharma. Thank you very much for joining us once again in this Dharma sharing brought to you by Wisdom Park, the Buddhist Education Resource Center of Universal Wisdom Foundation in the Philippines. It is my pleasure to once again offer this Dharma sharing through Wisdom Park. This is the third in a series of video lectures based on the first sermon delivered by the Buddha, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutra, setting into motion the wheel of Dharma, where the Buddha explained the Four Noble Truths and the medial way and the practice of the Eightfold Way. During these difficult times, where every single one of us is facing this coronavirus pandemic, we are facing all kinds of challenges, difficulties, uncertainties, and all kinds of problems in life. And the Buddha has reminded us that every one of us, we are always facing all kinds of challenges that bring about some form of suffering. So physical suffering, mental suffering. We spoke about this in the previous lecture. So today we will take a look at how we can cultivate and apply these mindfulness techniques to help us learn how to relax, calm our feelings, compose our mind, and be able to respond to challenges in a peaceful and harmonious way. When we face all kinds of difficulties, it makes us feel tensed, and that is the physical suffering. And with that tension comes a disturbance of the mind, and that is the mental suffering. And that leads to the arousal of emotions where we begin to react very emotionally. So today we're going to learn how to tame our emotional reactions. So the topic today is taming emotional reactions. And by taming our emotional reactions, it will reduce the suffering that we experience in daily life. Let us quickly review the Buddha's teaching on the noble truth of suffering. In the first noble truth, the Buddha stated that there is dukkha, and dukkha is normally translated as suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, and death is suffering. Separation from what is pleasing is suffering, which means when we have experienced something that is pleasant or something that has brought us happiness and we have lost it, that is suffering. Union with what is displeasing is suffering. That means when we experience something that is unpleasant, something that hurts us, and we are stuck with it, that is suffering. Not to get what one wants is suffering. That means we may have wishes, desires, ambitions, and aspirations, but they are not fulfilled. We can't seem to get what we wish for. That is suffering. But it is this last one which is the mother of all suffering. This is the root of all suffering, where the Buddha summarized it in brief. The five aggregates subject to clinging is suffering. The five aggregates refer to the process of perception by which we are able to see, hear, smell, taste, and touch through our five senses. And our sixth sense, the mind, thoughts arise. So all these arising lead to perception. And if we were to cling on to these perceptions, if we were to grasp at the signs of these perceptions, it will bring suffering to us. In the second noble truth, the Buddha stated that it is tanha that leads to suffering. Tanha is the root cause of all suffering. Tanha is commonly translated as craving, but my teacher, Bhante Punnaji, has pointed out that
tanha is more precisely translated as emotional reactions. That means we react emotionally. So there are three kinds of tanha. Tanha for sensual pleasures. That means we react to something that is pleasurable. This reaction leads to lust and greed for pleasures. It begins with lust and it leads to greed. We lust for something that is pleasant. We want it. We go after it. We chase after it. That is lust. But once we get it, we are not satisfied. We want more of it, and that is greed. And this condition is called lobha. So tanha for sensual pleasures lead to lobha, which is lust and greed for pleasures. The second type of tanha is tanha for non-existence. This is our emotional reaction to something that is unpleasant. We wish that it doesn't exist. We wish that it is not there. We want to get rid of it. And this leads to dosa, which is aversion and hatred towards these pleasures. It begins with aversion. We want to avoid it. But if we are stuck with it and we are not able to avoid it, then we begin to feel angry towards it. Anger arises. And after we feel angry towards something and it is still there, disturbing us or hurting us, we begin to hate it. So aversion eventually leads to hatred if we can't get rid of what is unpleasant. So dosa is aversion and hatred towards these pleasures. The third kind of tanha is tanha for continued existence. This is because we experience the environment through our body. Activities in the environment stimulate our sense organs, and our sense organs are located throughout our body. And therefore, we carry this notion that this body is me. And these perceptions arising in the mind disturbs the mind or affects the mind, and we begin to think, oh, the mind is me. So we begin to connect every experience to the notion of I, me, or mine. And this leads to moha, the delusion of a self-centered existence. So therefore, it is our emotional reaction that is the root cause of all suffering. And in the third noble truth, the Buddha stated that all this suffering can be brought to an end, nirodha. The complete ending of all suffering means it is the remainderless fading away and cessation of all emotional reactions, tanha. So we have to learn to give up and relinquish our emotional reactions so that we can gain freedom from emotional reactions, and we are no longer reliant on emotional reactions for our happiness. In the fourth noble truth, the Buddha described the way leading to the complete cessation of suffering by practicing the Eightfold Way. In a nutshell, we have to learn how to tame our emotional reactions in order to free ourselves from suffering. So in the face of challenging times, let us understand how physical suffering and mental suffering arise and hurt us. In the previous lecture, we described physical suffering as stress and mental suffering as distress. And we learned to apply basic mindfulness techniques to cultivate emotional composure. That means we are able to tame our emotions and become calm and composed, and then we are able to gain comfort, peace, and happiness. In order to understand how we can do that, we have to first understand what is happening in our mind. So let us revisit what the Buddha taught as the mind. The Buddha described the mind as an activity. The Buddha used three words to describe the activity of the mind. The first word is vijnana. and this is the process of perception by which we become aware of what was perceived through the sense organs. The second word is mano, which is the cognitive process that leads to cognition and conception, by which we are able to identify and interpret what we have experienced through our perceptions. The third word is chitta, which is the affective process, or more commonly known as emotions, that leads to mood and temperament. Mood refers to how we feel about something. It leads us to have a good mood if it is something pleasant, or we have a bad mood if it is unpleasant. Temperament refers to the urge to react. If it is something pleasant, we will react with lust and greed. If it is something unpleasant, we will react with aversion and hatred. And finally, with every experience, we tend to cling on to it. We personalize it, thinking that I am experiencing it. So the I, me, or mine becomes very strong, leading to the notion of a self-centered existence. We have discussed in previous lectures the meaning of the word dukkha, which is the word the Buddha used to describe suffering. Dukkha is normally translated as suffering, but it also means a variety of different forms of suffering. Let us now take a quick look at what happens on a daily basis that leads us to experience dukkha from time to time throughout the day. This is what I refer to as the inevitable realities of modern life. Environmental activities constantly stimulate our sense organs, bombarding our attention system. Circumstances keep changing and becoming unpredictable, giving rise to uncertainties and insecurities. People around us, they impose their demands and expectations upon us, putting pressure on us to respond. Deadlines and schedules, they drain away our energy resources. Obstacles, problems, and difficulties, they arise unexpectedly to hinder our planned activities and disrupt our peace. With these inevitable realities that we experience day in and day out, we constantly carry perception of threats and conflicts from the environment. And this leads to a whole lot of physical and mental suffering. We have discussed in previous lectures that this tiny structure in the brain called the amygdala is constantly scanning our sensory perceptions for any sign of potential threat. When it senses any sign of potential threat or conflict, it is activated and it triggers the release of stress hormones, causing this fight or flight reaction. This arouses emotions of fear, panic, anger, anxiety, distress, and so on. All this begins with physical suffering. Physical suffering is the manifestation of stress reactions in the body. We call this the fight or flight reaction, where the brain sends a message to the glands and powerful stress hormones are released and they flood through the body, causing various organs to react in unusual ways. Heart beating faster, blood pressure rising, respiration deepens, muscles become tensed, our hair standing on end, pupils dilate, facial expressions distorted. We begin to experience perspiration, trembling, or body temperature rising, blood sugar level rises, and body immune system is suspended. All these are very unhealthy to the body. So it causes great discomfort to the body first. And with this discomfort, it disturbs the mind. This fight or flight reaction, which leads to great discomfort in the body, is called stress. And when stress arises, it disturbs the mind, and the mental disturbance is called distress. When distress arises, it arouses all kinds of emotional states. That is why the Buddha stated in this Chitta Sutra, emotions dominate the world. Emotions create distress. Emotion is that one thing to which all are spellbound. Unless we train ourselves to prevent this emotional arousal getting out of control, we will experience what the Buddha called self-affliction of mental suffering. In this Dhammapada verse 42, the Buddha stated, whatever harm one enemy may do to another, or one hater to another, one's ill-directed emotions inflict upon oneself a greater harm. By ill-directed emotions, the Buddha was referring to the mind running away, and this is called mental proliferation, arising because of our imagination, our memory, and our expectation. Imagination is trying to imagine something that hasn't happened yet. Memory is trying to recall something that is long past gone. Expectation is trying to change something that is already existing. And all this leads to great emotional distress, and we fall under the spell of this emotional excitement. When we experience stress and distress, we have to do something about it. And the Buddha stated in the first two verses of the Dhammapada that it is the way we think that leads to suffering or happiness. Let us listen to my teacher, Bhante Punnaji, explain this.
The first verse in the Dhammapada, there in the first verse in the Dhammapada, what you get is Mano Pubbangama Dhamma, which is wrongly translated today. There, Mano means that thinking part. I told you there are two things, the thinking part and the emotional part, which is called Chitta. Mano Pubbangama means the thinking part comes first, before the emotional part. So it is by changing the thinking part, which is what is called the cognitive part, that the affective can be controlled. So it is the thinking part that is able to control. And that is the real secret discovered in the modern world by the cognitive psychologists. They are using that in what is called cognitive psychotherapy. They are using that principle, but still they are not able to fully control the emotions because they don't know about meditation. And but the Buddha used this method.
So in the first verse of Dhammapada, the Buddha pointed out, cognition precedes all experiences. Cognition predominates and creates them. So it is our thinking that creates our reality. And then the Buddha went on further to say, with vicious thought, if one speaks or acts, pain follows, just as the carriage follows the animal. Here, the Buddha very wisely used the ox and the cart as a metaphor for suffering. If we carry vicious thoughts whenever we deal with people around us, then we are creating suffering. And the ox is pulling the cart, and the cart is heavy. So all this becomes great burden to the ox. So the Buddha very cleverly used the ox and the cart to refer to suffering. In the second verse of Dhammapada, the Buddha went on to say, cognition precedes all experiences, it predominates and creates them. With virtuous thought, If one speaks or acts, happiness follows, just as one's inseparable shadow. Here again, the Buddha very cleverly used the shadow to represent happiness, because the shadow is not a burden at all and it follows us. So if we carry virtuous thoughts every time we speak or act, we are bringing about happiness, and that happiness follows us like our inseparable shadow. Emotions dominate the world. Emotions create distress. Emotion is that one thing to which all are spellbound. So when activities in the environment stimulate our sense organs, these external stimulus lead us to sensory perceptions, perceiving through our senses, to be able to see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. And then we begin to interpret what we have experienced. If it is something pleasant, oh, we like it. If it is something unpleasant, we want to get rid of it. So when things are not as they want, when we are separated from pleasures or pleasant experiences, when we are stuck with unpleasant experiences, we begin to perceive these as threats and conflicts. So with the perception of threat and conflict, emotions are aroused. The amygdala is activated and begins to release hormones flooding the body, causing discomfort to the body. This is the fight or flight reaction. So with the arousal of emotions and the body being disturbed, this is our stress reaction. With stress reaction arising, it disturbs the mind. The mental disturbance arises. This mental disturbance is distress, leading us to behave in habitual ways, habitual emotional reactions, producing all kinds of emotional states: greed, anger, fear, hatred, worry, anxiety, jealousy, conceit, shame. All kinds of emotional reactions begin to arise. And we cling on to this and say, oh, I don't like this, I am unhappy with this, the I, me or mine is so strong. This personalization or clinging leads us to feed our emotions further, causing even further disturbances, mental proliferation, where the mind begins to run away, thinking all kinds of thoughts from our imagination, memory, and expectations. Imagination, trying to imagine things that are not true, not real, hasn't happened yet. We begin to think of the worst case scenario. Memory, recalling past, somebody we have disliked in the past, and we begin to recall how it hurt us and we get angry with him again. Or having expectations that are unreal, trying to change things that have already happened. This is our emotional chain reaction. All this lead to this vicious cycle of emotions. So when we experience this vicious cycle of emotions, we got to do something about it. What can we do about it? We can learn to change our perception of what is happening. So we got to learn how to cultivate good thoughts. Bandipunaji earlier mentioned that modern psychologists have also discovered this. So here is a quote from a famous psychologist from the past, William James, where he said, "The greatest weapon against stress is our ability to choose one thought over another," which means we have the opportunity or the choice to choose how we interpret our circumstances. If we interpret our circumstances in a negative manner and carry vicious thought, we are bringing suffering. And if we were to interpret our circumstances with wholesome thoughts, and we carry virtuous thoughts when we speak or act, we are bringing happiness into our lives. And another famous psychiatrist and neurologist, Viktor Frankl, said this: "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. As Viktor Frankl reminded us, between stimulus and response, there is this space, this moment in time when we can choose our thoughts. It is our choices that lead to our happiness or further suffering. So how can we take advantage of this? I have mentioned this in the previous lecture. We practice the 3-step self-compassion. First, we have to cultivate mindfulness of our experiences. With every experience, we have to be mindful how it is affecting our body and our mind. So when something happens out there and it arouses our emotion, that is the stimulus. That is a kind of stressor, causing stress in us. So when we experience these arousals, it changes the body. So we have to be mindful that the body changes. The first thing we have to do is pause, allowing time for emotional excitement and anxiety to calm down, and hormonal reactions happening in the body to subside. We can't stop the hormonal reactions, but by pausing, allowing time for it to subside, it will gradually subside. But we can help this along with relaxation. So the second step is to relax. Take a deep breath. And when we are able to relax the body and consciously compose the mind, we are now ready to respond. So when the body is adequately relaxed and the mind is adequately composed, now is the time for us to respond. We think, purposefully focus on wholesome and beneficial response to the problem. And by purposefully focusing on wholesome and beneficial response to the problem, we are able to recover and adapt. So the first thing we have to realize about emotional arousals is the fact that it is our interpretation of our circumstances that lead to emotional arousals. So if we can learn to change our interpretations, we can tame our emotions. Therefore, the key lesson here is to learn how to interpret circumstances with peace and harmony. And by so doing, we are able to tame our emotional reactions. During the course of our mundane modern life, we will experience all kinds of inevitable realities that affect us in one way or another. These are difficulties, problems, challenges, interruptions, disruptions. If we begin to interpret these circumstances with the perception of threat or conflict, emotions will be aroused. And fight or flight reactions arise, and we begin to behave with habitual emotional reactions. So how can we transform this vicious cycle of emotions into virtuous cycle of composure? First, we have to be mindful of changes in bodily activities, observing that our heart is now beating faster, our breathing is deepening, muscles are getting tensed, and so on. So we have to be mindful of changes in bodily activities. And if we can do that, then we realize that emotions have been aroused. And if we were to carry on without doing something about it, it will lead to vicious cycle of emotions. So we got to learn to pause, relax, and think, and re-examine the way we interpreted our circumstances. If we can change our interpretations, we can tame our emotions. So we got to rethink how we have interpreted our circumstances and change from the perception of threat or conflict into the perception of
peace and harmony. And with that, we will be able to cultivate some level of emotional composure. The mind will be calm and the body will be relaxed. And then we can focus on purposeful, wholesome response to the problems. By so doing, we will be able to find peace and happiness in our lives, just as what the Buddha stated in the second verse of Dhammapada. With virtuous thought, if one speaks or acts, happiness follows, just as one's inseparable shadow.
And now let us listen to another psychologist, Daniel Goleman. Daniel Goleman has written many books, and his most notable works are books associated with emotional intelligence. So in this clip, Emotional Intelligence with Daniel Goleman, he briefly explained we have 3 windows of opportunity to deal with our problems.
Stress isn't really so much in the things that happen in your life. It's really in how we react to them. And we can do something about those reactions. There are 3 windows of opportunity when it comes to handling the stress in our lives. The first is to do something to change things for the better. You know, whatever's the cause of the stress, if you can change it, do it. The second is in how you see it, changing the way you perceive what's happening. Now, if we can't change the things that are happening to us and we can't change how we see it, then we're left with a third opportunity, and that's handling the way our body and our mind react to these things. See, when the body is stressed, the emotional centers flood the body with stress hormones. And this makes it do things like shunt blood from the arms and the legs into the organs. It's a fight-or-flight response. It pumps up our blood pressure, speeds up our heartbeat. It steals energy, actually, from the immune system, it turns out, to get us ready for an emergency. It's what's called the fight-or-flight response. You've heard about that. Now, if that response gets triggered day after day, week after week, and month after month, over years, what happens is the biological system in our body that's most susceptible genetically, that's most reactive, is going to start to develop a stress-caused disease. You know, if you're a cardiovascular reactor, you're going to get high blood pressure. If you react in your gut, you're going to get problems there, and so on throughout the body. That's how stress over years and years leads to disease. It speeds up the process of coming down with the disease. So constant stress, it's like getting your amygdala stuck in high gear. Continual hijacks. We need to calm down. That's where relaxation comes in.
Daniel Goleman pointed out that by remaining calm and relaxed, we have 3 windows of opportunity to handle our problems. First, if we can change our circumstances, if we can get rid of the problem, that would be wonderful. But we are not always blessed with this opportunity. So when we are not able to get rid of the problem, we can try to change how we perceive our circumstances, how we interpret what is happening, so that we are able to find inner peace, calmness, and comfort, so that we have peace of mind and comfort of body. And if we're not able to fulfill that properly, then the third opportunity is to change the way we respond. What are we going to do about it? Can we do something to take control of our own lives? So that is the third opportunity. So these are the 3 windows of opportunity. I would like to share with you my experience with this coronavirus pandemic. When the coronavirus pandemic struck, the whole world was affected. Nobody could do anything to change our circumstances. We were forced to face it. So here is another quote by Viktor Frankl. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. So in other words, we are left with the second and the third option. to change the way we perceive this coronavirus pandemic, and to change the way we respond to it. During the first 3 months of the lockdown, none of us was allowed to leave the house. Everybody had to stay at home. So we could not change that situation, but I perceived that as a great opportunity, because for some years before that, both my daughters had been busy with their careers, and we had very little opportunity to spend time together. During these 3 months of lockdown, we had a wonderful time. We perceived this as an opportunity for our sharing, for our bonding, for learning from each other, and for doing things together. So we cooked, we sat around watching TV, and we were all very anxious about news of the coronavirus pandemic. So all this, we perceive the circumstances differently. We no longer perceive it as a problem. We perceive it as an opportunity to bond, to share. And then we responded to it by spending time together, cooking together, having a great time, changing the way we respond to the circumstances. That is how we can overcome this pandemic. And another thing, now that we are allowed to go out, we have to change the way we respond. Wear face mask when you leave the house. Wash your hands frequently. Carry sanitizer and use it when you need to. Keep distancing. Keep social distancing and stay away from crowds. And watch what you touch. That is changing the way you respond to the coronavirus pandemic.
Let us now summarize taming our emotional reactions. First, be mindfully aware that emotions are aroused. So signs of emotional arousal comes from this fight or flight reaction, where the first thing that happens is that the body experiences tension. So be aware, be mindfully aware if the heart is beating faster, if the blood pressure is rising, if your breathing is deepening and your muscles are getting tensed, and so on. And realize that there is this space between stimulus and response. So from the moment your emotions are aroused, you have an opportunity. And what is this opportunity? This is the opportunity to choose your thoughts. So how can we do that? Pause, relax, and think. And by so doing, we are able to choose wholesome and beneficial responses to the problem. And examine how we interpret our circumstances. If we can change the interpretation from perception of threats and conflicts to the perception of peace and harmony, we can learn to deal with our emotions very easily. Emotions will not be aroused. Finally, realize there are 3 windows of opportunities where we can change our circumstances, we can change the way we interpret our circumstances, or we can change the way we respond to our circumstances. With this virtuous cycle of composure, whenever things are happening around us, change the way we respond things so that we are able to perceive our circumstances with the perception of peace and harmony. This will help us gain control of our situation, where we can then remain emotionally composed and feeling comfortable. Then we are ready to respond. Purposeful, wholesome response by pause, relax, and think. A relaxed body, a composed mind will bring peace and happiness into our lives. And now let's listen to the words of the Buddha in relation to taming these emotional reactions, learning how to still our emotions. The Buddha stated in this sutra, the Mangala Sutra, he said, when faced with changing vicissitudes of life, changing vicissitudes of life refers to circumstances that are changing, that are unpredictable, challenging, so they arise day in and day out, affecting us. This is the changing vicissitudes of life. If emotions can be stilled and remain undisturbed, again here the Buddha pointed out, it is very important to learn how to tame our emotions, learn to still them. By changing our interpretations, we are able to avoid the arousals of emotions and emotional reactions. So if emotions can be stilled and remain undisturbed, free from grief, cleansed of defilements, and liberated from fear, this is the most supreme bliss. And this is what the Buddha said in the Mangala Sutta. And with this, I conclude my presentation. Before I finish off, I would like to express my deep gratitude to my teacher, the late Venerable Dr. Madawela Punaji Mahathera. He has taught me well, he has guided me, motivated me to share the Dharma, and he has inspired me with his wisdom and compassion. I'm always grateful to all that he has done for me. May Bhante Punaji attain the highest and most supreme bliss of Nibbana. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And let us now share the merits we have acquired. We have spent this time wisely in sharing the Buddha Dharma, and in so doing, we have accumulated much merits from this wholesome and beneficial activity. Let us now put our palms together and share these merits with all sentient beings affected by the coronavirus pandemic. We dedicate the merits we have acquired from sharing of the Buddha Dharma to all beings affected by the coronavirus pandemic around the world. May suffering beings be suffering free. May the fear-struck fearless be. May grieving beings shed all grief. May all beings find peace and relief. By the grace of the merits we have acquired, may we never follow the foolish. May we follow only the wise until we attain the highest and most supreme bliss of Nibbana. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you very much. I wish you to stay safe. May you be well, comfortable, peaceful, and happy.